Greetings, friends. So I finished this book, FDR's Folly, How Roosevelt and His New Deal Prolonged the Great Depression by Jim Powell. And I do recommend this book. It's well written. It's very important factual information that's not really taught in our mainstream education system. And we're living with the consequences of the actions government took today. We're still living with that. Now, I'm not an expert on the subject, so I'm not speaking to you as a historian of the Great Depression, but I feel like I've read this book and I've read some other articles online, so why not share what I've come across with you? So if you're a historian, then feel free to have your own insight. But this viewpoint goes sort of against the mainstream picture, which, the Depression was solely caused by the stock market crash. So I can't do just one video talking about this book and the Great Depression. I think I'll do just this relatively shorter video today, just focusing on what caused the Great Depression. And then another video I can do is how did Herbert Hoover, who was president when the Depression initially struck, how did he respond? And then I'll do another video on the main focus of that book, how Roosevelt and his New Deal. And that might even take more than one video because there were all these different government programs that they did. And the Depression lasted a long time, from arguably October 1929. Well, maybe by 1930, 1931, that's when it was really being felt by the American population. And it's a misconception. And this isn't Jim Powell saying, well, maybe Jim Powell, other people too would say that. The Depression did not end when World War II began because of that mobilization of men. It went on until about 1947 when the need to resupply devastated Europe gave a reason for the American economy to pick up again, which isn't a great reason, right? Anyways, I'm getting sort of off the main topic here. So, yes, there was a stock market crash in 1929. This obviously did play a big role in the Depression, but it was not the decisive factor. Okay, and that stock market bubble was a product of the roaring 20s. So it was in the interwar period, and new technology like radios and especially the car, the automobile, was becoming available on a mass scale. So this was driving a lot of the growth in America, the very, very quick growth in terms of cities, in terms of, well, obviously stocks. There was a home construction boom, particularly in Florida, and they were advertising the great climate down there and go and build your house there. So there was a huge bubble there that peaked in 1926. So I admit, if it peaked in 1926, then was it a factor in the 1929 crash? Because that's already 3 years later. Maybe it didn't crash right away, but it sort of tailed off after that time. But it wasn't just Florida; it was a nationwide phenomenon in the United States. This home construction boom. So there was that element. But the real cause of the Great Depression was not the private market. It was meddling from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And that was connected to, it's sort of like a private bank, but, connected to the government. Now, that it wasn't exactly the Federal Reserve like it is today, because there was a Federal Reserve Bank and then it had member banks in the different states. I think there were not every state had them at the time. But the New York Federal Reserve Bank was sort of taking the leading role. And the head of that bank was a man named Benjamin Strong, who was in his mid-50s. And he died by the late 20s, he was dead. He died from tuberculosis. A lot of people died from like pneumonia and tuberculosis, even back in the 20s and the 30s. But at that time, he met, I think this was like 1926 or 27, he met with the head of the Reichsbank from Germany, and then the head of the Bank of England, and then a representative from France's major bank. So the central banking representatives from the big players in Europe. And the British were particularly keen on meeting with Mr. Strong because they had a problem with their own currency after World War I ended. Britain was heavily in debt from having to finance that terribly costly war. And now they wish to return to the gold standard, which was $4.86 for an ounce of gold. Now they wanted, or maybe that would be £4.80. I'm not actually sure, but they wanted to return to the original level, but they basically were kind of broke, so they couldn't do that. They would have to devalue the pound, and then they would lose pride, and they didn't want to lose any pride, so they were asking the Federal Reserve Bank of New York if they could help them out and buy $12 million worth of pounds by sending gold to England, to the Bank of England, to make this purchase. And one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York agreed to this was that many Americans had investments in British territories overseas, and they wanted to keep receiving their dividends, their payments from those investments in the strong British pound, not a devalued British pound. Then they would lose out. So they also, were basically, they wanted another related factor. This is connected to the Federal Reserve's action, was that people were saying, well, later historians were saying that the international monetary system was malfunctioning. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but they point out that, wages couldn't fall because of labor unions, which had become much stronger. So you wouldn't be able to return to the gold standard anymore, which, returning to that standard would require wages and prices to fall freely with the market. But now with these strong labor unions, that was no longer possible. Now, I agree politically it might not have been possible, but you still could have done it, and there's nothing wrong with the gold standard. Still should work. But anyways, the Federal Reserve, they were presiding over a situation in which the U.S. economy was growing. Interest rates were at 4% in the middle of the 1920s, and gold was flowing into the United States at that time. Capital was flowing into the United States. Because of this action, of sending all this gold, all this money out of the country to Britain, and they basically triggered a monetary contraction. So this monetary contraction was the main reason for the Great Depression. Around one third of the entire money supply of the United States went out of the country. So it contracted by 1/3. So this produced a situation where it was hard for people to get money to pay their debts. It was also hard to get credit. Suddenly, it's like you're taking the oil out of the car, so it's going to start breaking down sooner or later. Now, they didn't realize that was going to happen at the time, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And so this, when you put a central banker in charge of making these big decisions, it takes a long time for their decisions to have a measurable effect on the economy. It can take a year, it can take 2 years. So sometimes they don't understand that they have to wait a little bit before taking any other further action. But before they even noticed that there was this monetary contraction going on, Benjamin Strong, before he died, he pressured the other Federal Reserve member banks to buy $200 million worth of government securities. And then that would be injected into the banking system, the other banks. And then that money was assumed that it would end up in, government bonds. It would finance the expansion of business, but actually in a sense it did, but it found its way into the stock market, all of that extra printed money. So the gold went out of the country, and then they printed this more money, but it was just finding its way into the stock market. And so that arguably did contribute to the stock market boom and bust. So basically, this situation where there wasn't enough money. So the first thing that happened, not long after the Depression was, prices went down, wages went down, industrial output fell significantly. And it was just, the thing is, a lot of these people who needed money were farmers, especially because agricultural commodity prices had fallen. And I'll talk more about that in another video. But and the main reason for that is, again, adjusting to the world after World War I, where there wasn't so much need for American agricultural products to supply Europe, because Europe was recovering. But now all these farms in the U.S. had been over-leveraged, and they had been assuming that their commodity prices would stay high, but now they were crashing. So they needed money. So now that crash in prices, that's not directly related to the monetary contraction, but now they need money because obviously the prices have fallen and they might have to pay off their debts. And what do you know? There's less money available, so they're going to banks, and a lot of these small town banks were running out of all their money. And this is where we get another cause of the Great Depression. And this arguably extended into the 30s. This extended into the early 30s, even to the mid 30s. So some of these causes that you can't say it specifically caused it at one point in history, and then that's that. It's like, no, some of these are ongoing factors. But I chose to include this in the video because it is a cause of the Great Depression, which is the failure of banks. But that's directly related to government laws. Specifically, they were called unit banking laws. So those are a result of the lobby of small town or countryside bankers or really the like farmers. They had their own lobby. Everyone had their own. There were all these different special interest groups back then. But the small towns and their banks, they didn't want to have to compete with the big city banks because they couldn't compete with them. So they passed laws, and that's what's called the unit banking laws. Every bank across the country could only have one office. So, and it was basically limiting banks to a very small area of the country. And that effectively shut out the competition of those big city banks. But then, because of this monetary contraction and because all these people, at least in certain areas of the country, came to the banks to get their money, those banks failed. And actually later, up to 90% of small banks in the United States failed during the Depression. They went out of business because they didn't have any money. They were bankrupt. And now this is something that could have been prevented if the government hadn't listened to the lobby groups and said, okay, well, we'll shut out competition from the big city banks. And now I've spoken negatively of banks before. I don't like banks, but in this situation, there is a compelling argument that branch banking would have prevented this monetary crisis. I mean, it wasn't good what the Federal Reserve had done, but at least you would have had the big banks bailing out smaller banks. And in Canada, there were no bank failures. And Canada was hit just as hard by the monetary contraction as well. But there was branch banking in Canada, so a very big bank with different branches around the country. Not all parts of the country are going to, require cash the same. Some parts may be doing fine. So then there's more cash in one area of the country that can be sent to another branch to bail that out. So that, and likewise, there weren't any bank failures in Canada during the recent 2008 crisis either. But anyway, so because these banks were limited by these unit banking laws, which had originally meant to, make it easier for the small town banks, so they wouldn't have to compete. Well, then it ended up proving their downfall. But that just made it worse for everyone. So it was difficult to get cash, and then when you had these banking failures, there were a lot of bank moratoriums or bank holidays imposed. And some people say, well, it was necessary, you had to do that. But then there's the argument I've come across here is that no, that made the problem a lot worse because that spread uncertainty amongst depositors, even in states which hadn't imposed banking holidays. Then they're seeing what's happening in other states. And what is a banking holiday? It's basically the bank is shut down for a few days, a week. It started with Governor of Michigan, William Comstock, and that was on February 14th, 1933. So this, of course, is already well into the Depression, but that's when the banking holidays started, and then that was supposed to, prevent a bank from failing because maybe, if people aren't allowed to come and claim their money, then you can't say that you're bankrupt. But what ended up happening is that spread the panic to other states, and a lot of depositors who had their deposits in a state with no bank holidays, they saw what was happening, and then they said, well, I should get my money now in case the same thing happens. And then that put pressure on states that otherwise weren't affected. And also people in states that were affected by bank moratoriums, they might have deposits in other states, and then they'd be trying to take out their money from those banks in other states. So it's putting pressure all around, and it led to these huge collapse of banks. So that's basically the summary of why the Great Depression began. The stock market crash related to the home construction boom was at most a secondary factor. The primary factor was a monetary contraction as gold, the shift went around and flowed out of the United States, and that was a policy of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, approved by the government, and then of course the laws about unit banking, preventing branch banking. So it was a monetary, hard to get any money, hard to get credit. Later on, I'll talk more about that with how Herbert Hoover responded. He responded with one very terrible measure, which was the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, and that really hurt the United States. It hurt other countries around the world, and it provoked a lot of political unrest in the 1930s. But that's another topic for another video. Hope you enjoyed that. Happy 2018. Hasta luego, amigos.